What happens when a man with absolute authority meets a woman with absolute power? On a routine trans-Pacific flight, a decorated airline pilot, a king in his metal tube in the sky, commits an act of shocking aggression against a young Asian woman in first class. He sees her as insignificant, a nobody who doesn't belong. He humiliates her, and then he strikes her. But he's made a catastrophic mistake. He is completely unaware that the woman he just assaulted is not just another passenger. She is the silent, anonymous billionaire who owns the airline. And he just sealed his fate at 35,000 feet. This isn't just a story of revenge. It's a story of devastating karma, and the day a pilot learned the hard way that some passengers hold the power to ground him forever. The air in the first-class cabin of Horizon Airlines Flight 512 from San Francisco's SFO to Tokyo Narita was a carefully curated symphony of privilege. It smelled of expensive leather, hot towels, and the faint, crisp notes of complimentary champagne. Passengers, mostly men in tailored suits who exuded an aura of corporate importance, settled into their pods, the private cocoons that separated them from the mundane world of economy class. Lila Chen, however, did not fit their mold. Seated in 3A, she was an island of deliberate understatement in an ocean of overt wealth. At 28, she possessed a quiet intensity that people often mistook for shyness. She was dressed in a simple, elegant set of black cashmere loungewear, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, and on her feet were a pair of unassuming but meticulously crafted sneakers. There was no flashy jewelry, no designer logo screaming for attention. To a casual observer, she looked like a student who'd won a lottery upgrade, or perhaps the guest of a wealthier companion. The truth was far more complex. Lila Chen was the sole principal of LC Capital Group, a notoriously private investment firm that had, just 4 months prior, acquired a 68% controlling stake in Horizon Airlines, saving it from the brink of collapse. It was a silent partnership. The world knew a private capital group had saved the airline, but Lila's name was deliberately kept out of every press release. She valued her anonymity above all else. It allowed her to observe the world without the world observing her back. Today, she was flying to Tokyo for a week of clandestine operational reviews, wanting to experience her investment as any other passenger would. The first sign of trouble was subtle, a minor discord in the cabin's harmony. A portly man in a pinstripe suit, smelling of whiskey and self-importance, was struggling to fit his oversized carry-on into the overhead bin above his seat 3C, which was directly across the aisle from Lila. He grunted, shoved, and then, with a huff of frustration, turned his attention to the bin above Lila's seat. It was mostly empty, save for her small, lightweight backpack containing a laptop and a book. "Excuse me," he grunted, not at Lila, but in her general direction. "I need this space." Before Lila could even formulate a reply, a flight attendant named Carla appeared, her smile lacquered on. "Of course, sir. Let me help you with that." Carla, a woman in her late 40s with a severe blonde bob and an air of someone who had long ago traded genuine warmth for procedural efficiency, assessed the situation instantly. She saw the powerful-looking man in the suit and the young, casually dressed Asian woman. Her calculations were swift and biased. "Ma'am," Carla said, turning to Lila, her voice a full 2 octaves sweeter than the one she used for the man. "Would you mind if we moved your bag? We need to accommodate this gentleman's luggage." Lila blinked slowly. "There's plenty of room in his own bin if he just turns the bag sideways," she stated, her voice calm and even. "And this one is directly above my seat." Carla's smile tightened. "It's just that his is a proper roller case. Yours is a backpack. It could fit under your seat." "I'm aware," Lila said, a hint of steel now underpinning her quiet tone. "I prefer to keep it up here. There is, as you can see, ample room for both." The man in the suit scoffed. "Just move the damn bag, will you? Some of us have places to be." The confrontation was as petty as it was predictable. A tiny power play Lila had witnessed 1,000 times in 1,000 different settings. It was the casual dismissal, the assumption that her comfort was secondary, her presence an imposition. Carla, sensing her preferred passenger's impatience, reached up and without asking for permission again, grabbed Lila's backpack. "I'll just pop it under the seat for you. No trouble at all." "Leave it, please," Lila said, her voice dropping, losing all its earlier softness. It was a command, not a request. A sudden authority in her tone made Carla freeze, her hand still on the bag. The man in 3C huffed loudly. The quiet hum of the cabin was disrupted. A few other passengers glanced over, their curiosity piqued. "Is there a problem here?" Carla asked, her professional veneer cracking to reveal a flash of irritation. She was no longer being helpful. She was being challenged. "There is," Lila replied, her eyes locking onto the flight attendants. "The problem is, you've decided your primary job is to appease one passenger at the expense of another, based on nothing more than a superficial judgment. Now please take your hand off my property." The man in the suit exploded. "Oh, for God's sake, what is this nonsense? I'm a Platinum Elite member. I've been flying this airline for 20 years. Get your supervisor. Better yet, get the pilot." When Carla, seeing an escape route that re-established her authority, seized it. "Of course, sir. I'll go and get the captain. He'll sort this out." She shot Lila a look that was pure venom before turning on her heel and marching toward the cockpit, leaving a thick, uncomfortable silence in her wake. Lila leaned back in her seat, her heart beating a little faster, not with fear, but with a familiar, weary anger. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the owner. And this was her airline. This was her problem. And she had a sinking feeling it was about to get much, much worse. A few minutes later, a tall, imposing figure emerged from the cockpit, his silver and white pilot's uniform pristine, his jaw set like granite. On his chest, a name tag read, Captain Daniel Pierce. He strode into the first-class cabin, not as a customer service agent, but as a commander entering a battlefield, and his eyes immediately sought out the source of the disturbance. Captain Daniel Pierce was a man carved from the old school of aviation. A former Navy pilot, he believed in two things: the sanctity of his aircraft and the immutability of his command. To him, the plane was not a vehicle. It was his domain, a kingdom of aluminum and jet fuel, where his word was law. He was known among the crew for his rigid demeanor and a temper that could flare from 0 to incandescent in seconds if he felt his authority was questioned. He strode down the aisle, his polished black shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. Carla trailed in his wake like a loyal adjutant, pointing a discreet, accusatory finger towards Lila. Pierce's eyes, a pale, unforgiving blue, swept over the scene. He saw the indignant, red-faced businessman, a man who looked like he belonged in first class. Then his gaze fell upon Lila. He saw not a person, but a profile. Young, Asian, female, and dressed in what he considered glorified pajamas. His mind, a repository of decades of ingrained biases, rendered its verdict in a nanosecond. She was the problem. He ignored Lila completely, addressing the man in 3C first. "Sir, I'm Captain Pierce. I understand there's been some sort of disturbance." His voice was deep, resonant, and coated in a thin layer of condescending calm. "Finally," the man boomed. "This woman," he said, jabbing a thumb towards Lila, "is refusing to follow the flight attendant's instructions. She's being disruptive and aggressive over a simple bag. I just want to stow my luggage and have a peaceful flight." Pierce nodded slowly, gravely, as if hearing testimony of a great crime. He then turned to Lila, his posture shifting. He stood over her, using his height to intimidate, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "Young lady," he began, the paternalistic term a deliberate choice. "My flight attendant is responsible for safety and order in this cabin. If she gives you an instruction, you are to follow it. Immediately, is that understood?" Lila met his gaze without flinching. "Captain, your flight attendant attempted to move my personal property without my consent after I had already pointed out that there was sufficient room for both bags. The issue isn't about space. It's about her unilateral decision to inconvenience me for another passenger's comfort. Pierce's eyebrow twitched. He wasn't accustomed to calm, articulate rebuttals from people he had already dismissed. He expected tears, or shouting, or sullen compliance. This was different, and it annoyed him. "I'm not here to debate the finer points of cabin etiquette," he snapped, his voice hardening. "I'm here to maintain order. The bag goes under the seat. End of discussion." "I don't believe that's a reasonable solution," Lila said, her voice remaining steady, though a knot of ice was forming in her stomach. She was testing the system, her system, and it was failing spectacularly. "Reasonable," Pierce let out a short, incredulous laugh. "What's not reasonable is a passenger in 3A holding up the departure of a multi-million-dollar aircraft carrying 200 people because she doesn't want a backpack at her feet. Now, for the last time, move the bag, or I will have you removed from my aircraft." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. To be removed from a flight was a public shaming, an accusation of wrongdoing that would follow you. It was the nuclear option, and he had deployed it over a backpack. Across the aisle, a quiet man in seat 4A, who had been observing the exchange over his copy of the Financial Times, a corporate lawyer named Mr. Nakamura, cleared his throat. "Captain, with all due respect, the young lady has a point. There is plenty of room in the bin. This seems like a disproportionate response." Pierce's head whipped around to face Mr. Nakamura, his eyes flashing with fury. "You will stay out of this, sir. This is a crew matter." He turned back to Lila, his face now a mask of cold rage. His authority had been questioned twice. "That's it. I've had enough of your attitude." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The smell of stale coffee and self-righteousness washed over her. "You think you can just come in here in first class and do whatever you want? You think the rules don't apply to you?" "The rules should apply to everyone equally," Lila whispered, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed anger. "Including your crew." And that was what broke him. It was the final challenge, the quiet, dignified defiance he could not tolerate. What happened next was a blur of motion, a shocking violation of the cabin's fragile peace. Captain Pierce's hand shot out. It wasn't a punch, but something far more demeaning. He slapped her, an open-palmed, stinging slap across the cheek that cracked through the silence of the cabin like a gunshot. Lila's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. A collective gasp rippled through the first-class passengers. The man in 3C looked stunned. Carla's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and morbid satisfaction. Mr. Nakamura shot to his feet. "My God, did you just strike a passenger?" Lila slowly turned her head back to face Pierce. Her cheek was blazing, a crimson mark already blooming on her skin. But there were no tears in her eyes. There was only a terrifying, glacial calm, the kind of calm that precedes a cataclysm. She didn't say a word. She just looked at him, her gaze boring into his, imprinting his face, his name, his unforgivable action into her memory. Pierce, realizing what he'd done, took a half-step back. A flicker of panic crossed his face, before being replaced by a desperate, blustering self-defense. "She was insubordinate, a security risk," he stammered, his voice suddenly unsteady. "I acted to maintain control of my aircraft. This is my right as captain." He looked around, seeking validation, but found only wide, horrified eyes. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He had physically assaulted a passenger. In his arrogance, in his blind prejudice, Captain Daniel Pierce had just made the single greatest mistake of his entire career. He just had no idea how monumental that mistake truly was. He thought he had silenced a problem. In reality, he had just armed a titan. The aftermath of the slap was a vacuum of sound and motion. The very air in the cabin seemed to have been sucked out, leaving only a ringing silence punctuated by the low hum of the auxiliary power unit. For a moment, everyone was frozen, actors in a tableau of disbelief. Captain Pierce, his hand still tingling, stared at Lila. a dawning horror beginning to pierce his thick armor of self-righteousness. Lila broke the spell. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't even touch her stinging cheek. Instead, she slowly, deliberately, reached into the seat pocket in front of her and retrieved her phone. Her movements were fluid and unnervingly calm. She held Pierce's gaze as her thumb moved across the screen, her expression as placid and unreadable as deep water. Mr. Nakamura, the lawyer in 4A, was the first to find his voice. "This is a criminal assault," he said, his tone sharp and precise. He had already taken out his own phone and was recording, his hand steady. "Captain, I am a witness and I can assure you your justification will not hold up in any court of law. You have assaulted this woman." He then looked at Lila. "Ma'am, my name is Ken Nakamura. I'm a partner at Hayashi & Partners. Here is my card. You will need a witness, and I will be glad to provide a sworn statement to the authorities." He extended a business card. Lila accepted it with a small, grateful nod, never taking her eyes off Pierce. Carla, the flight attendant, finally napped out of her shock, her instincts for damage control kicking in, albeit in the most misguided way possible. She rushed to Pierce's side, placing a hand on his arm. "Captain, perhaps we should just close the door and get on our way," she whispered urgently, as if taking off would somehow leave the incident behind on the tarmac. "We can sort this out once we're in the air." "No," Lila said. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the cabin with absolute finality. It was the first word she had spoken since the assault. She looked down at her phone, at the single text message she had composed. It was addressed to a contact named Hiroshi Tanaka, the CEO of Horizon Airlines. The message was brief and chillingly corporate. "Hiroshi. Code red on Horizon 512 at SFO. Asset compromised by crew. Await my instructions upon landing at NRT. Proceed with flight as scheduled. No ground communication." She pressed send. The code red was a pre-established protocol designed for a catastrophic event like a hijacking or a terror threat. The asset compromised was a phrase they had coined for a situation where her identity as the owner was at risk of being exposed, or in this case, where the integrity of her investment was being directly harmed by its own employees. Instructing the flight to proceed was a calculated move. She didn't want this resolved on the ground in San Francisco, where Pierce could spin a story to local authorities. She wanted this dealt with on her terms, in her territory, after he had been trapped in a metal tube with his crime for 11 hours, stewing in the consequences of his actions. "We will proceed with the flight," Lila announced, her voice now resonating with an authority that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. She looked at Carla. "Please take my backpack and place it under my seat, as you originally wished." Stunned into obedience by Lila's unnerving composure, Carla numbly did as she was told. Captain Pierce, pale and sweating, seemed to shrink back. He wanted to argue, to reassert his command. But the look in Lila's eyes, a look devoid of fear, filled only with a cold, terrifying purpose, paralyzed him. He gave a jerky nod, turned without another word, and retreated to the safety of his cockpit, closing the door with a click that echoed like a cell door locking. The flight to Tokyo was the most tense 11 hours of Daniel Pierce's life. Every chime from the cabin, every request for a drink felt like an accusation. He flew the plane with impeccable technical precision, his hands steady on the controls, but his mind was a maelstrom of fear and confusion. Who was that woman? The way she had taken control? The way the lawyer had jumped to her defense? It didn't make sense. He replayed the slap over and over, his initial justification crumbling with each passing minute, replaced by a cold dread. In the cabin, Lila sat in perfect stillness. She declined meals. She declined drinks. She simply sat, staring ahead, a silent, powerful rebuke to the violence she had endured. The other first-class passengers avoided her gaze, whispering amongst themselves. The man in 3C, the catalyst for the whole affair, had sunk into his seat, looking deeply uncomfortable, occasionally stealing worried glances at her. Mr. Nakamura gave her a reassuring nod from time to time, a silent promise of support. As the plane began its final descent into Narita, the soft morning light of Tokyo filtering through the windows, a sense of impending doom filled the cabin. For the passengers, it was the end of a flight. For Lila Chen, it was the beginning of the reckoning. And for Captain Pierce, it was the end of everything. He had no idea that a single text message sent before takeoff had set in motion a corporate firestorm on the ground, an inferno that was waiting patiently for him just beyond the jet bridge. He landed the plane smoothly, a perfect landing that was, in reality, a crash landing of his entire life. As Horizon Airlines Flight 512 taxied toward its designated gate at Narita Terminal 1, Captain Daniel Pierce felt a sliver of his old confidence return. The landing had been flawless. He was back on solid ground in a familiar airport. He convinced himself that the incident, while regrettable, could be managed. He would file a report emphasizing the passengers' disruptive and insubordinate behavior. He would frame the slap as a measured action to prevent escalation. It would be his word, the word of a 25-year veteran captain against a nobody. He might get a reprimand, perhaps mandatory anger management classes, but he would survive. He was, after all, Captain Pierce. The jet bridge docked with a gentle bump. The seatbelt sign pinged off. Pierce's voice came over the intercom, a little strained, but attempting to project normalcy. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tokyo Narita. We hope you enjoyed your flight with Horizon Airlines." In the first-class cabin, there was a collective sigh of relief. The ordeal was over. Passengers began to stand, gathering their belongings, eager to escape the charged atmosphere. Lila Chen, however, remained seated. She watched the cabin door, her expression patient, expectant. Pierce emerged from the cockpit, his cap tucked under his arm, his face a carefully constructed mask of professional calm. He intended to stand by the door, as was customary, to bid farewell to the passengers, a final assertion of his authority. Carla stood beside him, her face pale, her smile brittle. The cabin door was opened by the ground crew, and the scene at the gate was not what anyone expected. There were no police officers waiting with handcuffs. There was no irate family member waiting to confront the captain. Instead, standing just inside the jet bridge was a small delegation of people who radiated an aura of extreme importance and even greater panic. At the front was a man in his early 50s, his tailored suit immaculate, but his face ashen. His brow was slick with sweat, and his eyes darted nervously toward the plane's entrance. This was Hiroshi Tanaka, the CEO of Horizon Airlines, a man who typically spent his mornings in high-level board meetings, not waiting on a jet bridge like a chauffeur. Flanking him were two others. A severe-looking woman with a briefcase whom Pierce recognized as Akiko Sato, the head of the airline's entire Asia-Pacific legal department, and a burly man in a dark suit, whose earpiece marked him as the head of airport security. Hiroshi Tanaka's eyes scanned the disembarking passengers, dismissing them with a flicker of impatience. He was looking for someone. His gaze landed on Lila. Ignoring the line of first-class passengers, Hiroshi and his entourage pushed past them and entered the aircraft. They walked directly to seat 3A. The other passengers, including the businessman from 3C, stopped in their tracks, watching in stunned silence. Hiroshi Tanaka came to a halt before Lila, his posture a mixture of deference and terror. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow of his head. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice a low, trembling whisper that was somehow audible in the suddenly silent cabin. "On behalf of the entire company, I am so profoundly sorry. Are you all right? Please come with us. We have a private lounge and a car waiting." Miss Chen. The name echoed in the silence. Captain Pierce, standing by the door, felt a jolt as if he'd touched a live wire. Chen? Where had he heard that name? It tickled at the edge of his memory, something from a dry corporate memo, a name associated with the new ownership. LC Capital Group. LC. Lila Chen. It was impossible. It couldn't be. Lila stood up slowly, her gaze sweeping past the terrified CEO to land once more on Captain Pierce. She held his stare for a long, agonizing moment. In her eyes, he saw no anger, no triumph. He saw only the calm, dispassionate finality of a judge who had already passed sentence. She gave a single sharp nod to Hiroshi. "Thank you, Hiroshi. I'll be right with you." She then walked down the aisle. As she passed Mr. Nakamura, she paused. "Mr. Nakamura," she said, her voice clear and warm for the first time. "My legal team will be in touch. Thank you for your integrity." Mr. Nakamura, his jaw slack with astonishment as he connected the dots, simply nodded. "Of course, Miss Chen. Any time." Then Lila reached the front of the plane. She stopped directly in front of Captain Pierce and Carla. The CEO and his team hovered behind her, afraid to even breathe too loudly. Pierce felt the blood drain from his face. His skin went cold. The carefully constructed reality he had inhabited for decades was shattering around him like glass. The nobody in the cashmere sweatsuit, the disruptive young woman, Miss Chen, the silent C in LC Capital. Carla looked from Lila to the CEO and back again, her face a comical mask of confusion and dawning horror. Her mind, unable to process the cataclysmic shift in power, simply shut down. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and with a soft sigh, she fainted, crumpling to the floor in a heap of polyester and broken assumptions. Pierce didn't even notice. He was trapped in Lila Chen's gaze. He opened his mouth to say something, to apologize, to explain, to beg. But no words came out. His voice, the instrument of his command, had deserted him. Lila didn't say a word to him. She didn't need to. With a final dismissive glance, she turned and walked off the plane, flanked by the highest-ranking officials in the company. Hiroshi Tanaka threw a look over his shoulder at Pierce, a look of pure, unadulterated fury and terror. "Don't you go anywhere," he hissed. "You have no idea what you've done." Captain Daniel Pierce stood frozen in the doorway of his aircraft, the kingdom where he had been an absolute monarch just minutes before. He was no longer a captain. He was just a man, suddenly terrifyingly small, who had slapped a billionaire. And his trial was about to begin. The main boardroom at Horizon Airline's Tokyo headquarters was a place of immense power. A long, polished teak table reflected the vibrant Tokyo skyline from the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a room designed for billion-dollar deals and ruthless corporate strategy, a chamber where careers were made and broken with a quiet nod. Today, it was to be a courtroom. Lila Chen sat at the head of the table, a position that was rightfully hers. She had taken a few hours in the provided luxury suite to shower and change. The simple cashmere loungewear was gone, replaced by a razor-sharp dark navy pantsuit and a silk blouse. Her hair was immaculate, her expression serene. She looked every bit the formidable, untouchable figure she was. The faint red mark on her cheek had faded, but its memory hung in the room like a ghost. Across from her sat Hiroshi Tanaka, the CEO, and Akiko Sato, the head of legal. They had stacks of files in front of them, but dared not open them. They sat in rigid silence, waiting for her to speak. "Bring them in," Lila said finally, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, quiet room. A security guard opened the heavy oak doors. Captain Daniel Pierce and Carla were escorted inside. They looked utterly broken. Pierce's uniform, once a symbol of pride and authority, now looked like a costume on a man who had shrunk. His face was pale and haggard. Carla, having been revived and given a glass of water, had been weeping for 2 hours straight. Her makeup was a disastrous mess, her eyes puffy and red. They were led to 2 chairs placed in the center of the room, far from the table like defendants in a dock. Pierce's eyes flickered around the room, at the opulence, the grim faces, and finally at Lila. The last vestiges of his denial evaporated, replaced by the sickening, gut-wrenching certainty of his doom. Lila let the silence stretch, a tool she often used to great effect. She let them stew in their fear, forcing them to confront the chasm between their status a few hours ago and their status now. Finally, she leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "Captain Pierce," she began, her voice disarmingly soft. "I'd like to give you an opportunity to explain your actions on Flight 512 this morning. In your own words." Pierce swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He cleared his throat. "Miss Chen, I deeply apologize. My conduct was unprofessional. I was under a lot of stress. The passenger," he started, then corrected himself. "You were not complying with crew instructions, and I made a judgment call. A terrible, terrible judgment call." "A judgment call," Lila repeated, her voice flat. "Let's talk about that judgment. When you looked at me, Captain, what did you see?" I saw a passenger causing a disruption," he stammered, avoiding her eyes. "No," Lila said, her voice hardening. "That's not what you saw. Be honest. You saw a young Asian woman who you decided didn't belong in your first-class cabin. You saw someone you could intimidate, someone you could bully, someone whose presence you could dismiss without consequence. Your judgment call was not based on safety protocols. It was based on prejudice. You didn't see a passenger. You saw a problem that fit a profile you carry in your head." She paused, letting the accusation land with the force of a physical blow. "And when your authority was met with calm, quiet defiance instead of the submission you expected, you resorted to violence. You struck me." She turned her gaze to Carla, who flinched as if she'd been struck herself. "And you, Carla, your job is to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers, yet you immediately sided with the more overtly wealthy-looking man. You ignored procedure, you ignored common courtesy, and you escalated a minor issue into a major confrontation because you too made a judgment. You were not a flight attendant. You were an enabler." Carla burst into a fresh round of sobbing. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know. If I had known who you were, I would have—" "You would have what?" Lila cut her off, her voice like ice. "Groveled, fawned over me? That's the entire point. It should not matter who I am. Whether I am the owner of this airline or a student flying for the first time, the standard of respect should be absolute. The fact that you would treat me differently had you known is precisely why you are unfit for your job." Lila stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling city below. "Hiroshi," she said without turning around. "When my firm acquired this airline, we didn't just buy assets. We bought a brand, a reputation that is now tarnished. This incident, I've discovered, is not an anomaly. A preliminary review of customer complaints shows a disturbing pattern of dismissiveness toward minority passengers. Captain Pierce has been named in 3 prior complaints for his abrasive and discriminatory behavior, all of which were dismissed by internal review with a mere slap on the wrist." Hiroshi Tanaka visibly paled. He knew this was true. It had been easier to protect a senior pilot than to address the systemic rot. Lila turned back to face the room. Her eyes were blazing with a cold fire. "This is not about my cheek, which has healed. This is about the health of my company. Captain Pierce, your actions have proven that your judgment is a catastrophic liability. You are a danger to the passengers, the crew, and the brand. Carla, your compliance and prejudice demonstrate a fundamental failure to understand the basic principles of your role." She looked at Hiroshi. "Their employment with Horizon Airlines is terminated, effective immediately." Pierce slumped in his chair, as if his spine had been removed. "My pension," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "My 25 years." Akiko Sato, the lawyer, spoke for the first time, her voice crisp and merciless. "Your pension is subject to the terms of your employment contract, which includes a clause for termination with cause for gross misconduct, including assault of a passenger. We will be reviewing all options. You will be lucky to see a fraction of it. Lila then delivered the final devastating blow. Furthermore, she said, her voice ringing with authority, we will be fully cooperating with the Japanese authorities and the FAA. A copy of Mr. Nakamura's video, his sworn statement, and statements from 3 other first-class passengers have already been forwarded to them. We will be recommending a full and permanent revocation of your pilot's license. You will not be the commander of an aircraft ever again, not for this airline, not for any airline. It was a corporate execution, swift, total, and absolute. Pierce didn't just lose his job. He lost his identity, his future, his entire life's work, all because of a single, arrogant, prejudiced act. He stared into the abyss, finally understanding the true meaning of power. Not the petty authority he wielded in his cabin, but the silent, world-altering power of the woman he had struck. The fallout from the boardroom execution was not a singular event, but a slow, grinding process of dismantlement. It was a shockwave of consequence that didn't just ripple outwards, but seeped into the very foundations of the lives Daniel Pierce and Carla had built. For them, karma became a daily reality, a series of cold, hard, and inescapable truths. Captain Daniel Pierce's downfall was a masterclass in public humiliation and private disintegration. Horizon Airline's legal team, operating with the zealous efficiency of soldiers defending a new queen, presented the Japanese authorities and aviation regulators with a case so airtight it was more of a coffin. The video from Ken Nakamura's phone became Exhibit A, a damning, unassailable record of his aggression. Facing the prospect of a lengthy, reputation-shredding trial and certain jail time, Pierce accepted a plea bargain for a lesser assault charge. He was spared prison, but sentenced to a lifetime of shame. The true sentence was passed not in a court of law, but in the court of his peers. The FAA and Japan's JCAB, in a rare joint statement, described his actions as a catastrophic failure of temperament and permanently revoked his license. The document, stripped of jargon, declared him unfit to command. The man whose entire identity was woven into the fabric of his uniform, his call sign, and the view from 35,000 feet, was irrevocably grounded. His professional death was swift, but his personal decay was slow. He tried to leverage his 25 years of experience into a simulator instructor role, but the aviation world is a small, gossiping village. The story of the slap-happy captain had become a cautionary tale whispered in cockpits and crew lounges from Singapore to Seattle. No one would hire him. His name was toxic, a liability no insurer would touch. The pride that had once been his defining characteristic curdled into a bitter, impotent rage, which then slowly dissolved into a hollow despair. He sold the large house in the suburbs, the one with the pool he rarely used, and the 3-car garage to cover the mountain of legal fees. His wife, who had married a commander of the skies, found she had little patience for a broken man who spent his days staring at the ceiling. She left him 6 months later. Pierce moved into a drab 2-room apartment overlooking a motorway, where the constant roar of traffic was a poor substitute for the roar of jet engines. His final landing spot was a dispatcher's chair at a regional trucking company in Chiba. His world shrank to a cracked computer monitor and a radio headset. His commanding voice, once used to guide a 200-ton machine through thunderstorms, was now used to route shipments of frozen fish and industrial parts. "Big Rig 12, you're clear for Junction 16. Watch for delays near Narita," he would say. Sometimes, on a clear day, he would see the contrail of a trans-Pacific flight, slicing through the blue expanse above, a silver needle stitching a path to a world he could no longer access. In those moments, he wouldn't feel anger anymore, just a vast, empty ache, the phantom limb pain of a life that had been amputated. Carla's karma was a quieter, more insidious torture of repetition. Fired for gross misconduct, Her 30-year career evaporated without severance or pension. Her black mark wasn't just for enabling an assault, but for a fundamental failure of professional duty, a phrase that made her unemployable in any customer-facing airline role. She found herself adrift in a job market that had no place for a 50-year-old woman with a highly specialized, but now useless, skill set. She eventually found work as a hostess at a TGI Fridays in a sprawling shopping mall, the kind of place she used to look down on from the sky. The crisp uniform was replaced by a garish red and white striped polo shirt that was perpetually sticky. Her life became a loop of forced smiles, condescending customers, and the endless litany of, "How many in your party?" Every day, she was forced to be pleasant to people who treated her as background noise, a functional object to lead them to a table. It was a perfect, grinding mirror of the disdain she had shown Lila. She saw her own dismissiveness reflected back at her 100 times a day, in the impatient sighs of shoppers and the entitled smirks of teenagers. She never developed true remorse, only a deep well of self-pity. She didn't regret her prejudice, only that she had aimed it at the wrong person. The 512 incident became a legend within Horizon Airlines, a corporate fable that marked a definitive line between the before and the after. Lila Chen was not content with merely punishing the offenders. She was determined to incinerate the culture that had created them. She launched the Dignity and Service Initiative, a mandatory top-to-bottom re-education of the entire company. It was not a series of boring PowerPoint presentations. She brought in sociologists, hostage negotiators, and seasoned social workers to run immersive role-playing workshops. Pilots were forced to play the role of frightened, non-English-speaking passengers. Flight attendants reenacted scenarios of dealing with passengers with hidden disabilities. Executives spent a day working the check-in counters. Resistance from the old guard was met with a simple choice: adapt or leave. Many chose to take early retirement. Lila promoted a sharp, empathetic woman named Aiko Yamada to the newly created role of Chief Passenger Experience Officer. Aiko, the daughter of immigrants who had faced her own share of casual discrimination, became Lila's sword. She implemented a no-fault reporting system where crew could flag discriminatory behavior from colleagues without fear of reprisal. She tied 30% of every senior manager's bonus to measurable improvements in customer satisfaction scores from minority demographics. The airline's marketing was revolutionized. The sleek, impersonal ads of planes flying over canyons were replaced with intimate, documentary-style portraits of passengers and crew. An elderly Japanese woman visiting her grandchildren in Osaka, a young gay couple on their honeymoon, a flight attendant with a prosthetic leg. The slogan was simple and powerful: Horizon Airlines. Every journey matters. Every person counts. The message was clear. This was not your father's airline anymore. Months later, Lila stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her San Francisco office, looking down at the city lights. On her desk was the latest quarterly report. Profits were up a staggering 18%, but that wasn't the number that mattered. Customer complaints were down 72%. The airline had just won 3 separate industry awards for Most Improved Customer Service and Excellence in Corporate Culture. She thought back to that moment on the plane, the shocking crack of the slap, the heat on her cheek, the glacial rage that had solidified in her core. It was a moment of profound violation, a raw and ugly reminder of a world that still saw her as less than. But she hadn't sought simple revenge. Revenge would have been firing Pierce and letting the company continue its slow decay. She had sought something far more difficult and far more satisfying: systemic justice. She had used her power not as a cudgel to punish, but as a scalpel to excise the cancer within her own company. Daniel Pierce and Carla had been grounded, their lives reduced to cautionary tales. But in their place, thousands of others, passengers and crew alike, had been given the wings of dignity and respect. The unseen passenger had finally forced the entire world to look closer, and in doing so, had made sure everyone was seen. 2 years passed. In the fast-moving world of corporate turnarounds, 2 years can be an eternity. For Horizon Airlines, it was a renaissance. Under the steady, unseen hand of Leela Chen and the visible, energetic leadership of Aiko Yamada, the airline had become the darling of the industry. It was no longer just a carrier. It was a case study. Stanford Business School wrote about its cultural transformation. Competitors, once dismissive, now scrambled to imitate its dignity and service model, especially after a rival airline became embroiled in a viral scandal over the mistreatment of a disabled passenger. Horizon, once on the brink of failure, was now the gold standard for corporate responsibility, and its profits soared in tandem with its reputation. Lila, too, had changed. The incident had forced her out of the shadows. While she still fiercely guarded her public anonymity, she had embraced her role as a leader within her own empire. She was no longer a silent backer. She was an active architect. The ugly confrontation on Flight 512 had taught her a harsh lesson. True power wasn't just in ownership, but in stewardship. It wasn't enough to buy a company. You had to be responsible for its soul. It was this newfound sense of responsibility that brought her to a sprawling logistics and distribution hub on the outskirts of Tokyo on a dreary Tuesday afternoon. LC Capital had recently acquired the hub as part of a strategic expansion into supply chain management. Lila was on a quiet, low-key tour, walking the vast warehouse floors and observing the intricate dance of commerce. She was in the central dispatch office, a glass-walled room overlooking a sea of trucks, when she heard it. A voice. It crackled over the intercom system, directing vehicles with a weary precision. It was a voice stripped of its former arrogance, yet it retained a deep, resonant timbre that was instantly, chillingly familiar. Unit 44, you're heavy on the way in. Reroute to Base 17 for redistribution. Acknowledge. Lila stopped dead. Her guide, the facility manager, looked at her, concerned. Miss Chen, is everything all right? Lila didn't answer. She stared at the rows of dispatchers hunched over their monitors, their faces bathed in the green glow of tracking software. And then she saw him. He was thinner, his shoulders slumped forward in a permanent posture of defeat. The once proud silver hair was dull and unkempt. He wore a cheap, frayed headset and stared intently at his screen, a man entirely consumed by the small, manageable world in front of him. It was Daniel Pierce. A cold, strange feeling washed over Lila. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't anger. It was the unsettling sensation of seeing a ghost. The facility manager, seeing her fixed gaze, whispered, "Ah, that's Pierce. Bit of a grump, but he's the best dispatcher we've got. Ex-military, I think. Keeps the trucks moving like clockwork." "I'd like to speak with him," Lila said, her voice quiet but firm. "In private." The manager looked confused, but immediately complied. A few minutes later, Daniel Pierce was led into a small, sterile office. He walked in with a shuffling gait, his eyes on the floor, assuming he was in trouble for some minor infraction. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Sato?" he asked, not looking up. "It wasn't me, Daniel," the manager said, gesturing towards Lila before discreetly exiting and closing the door behind him. Pierce slowly lifted his head. His eyes met Lila's. For a full 10 seconds, he simply stared, his face a slack mask of incomprehension. Then, the recognition dawned. It wasn't a flash of anger or fear. It was a slow, catastrophic crumbling. The last vestiges of his pride, the thin walls he had built around his shame, turned to dust. He visibly shrank, his face turning a mottled, ashen gray. He looked like a man who had just seen the embodiment of his own damnation. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. Lila walked over to the water cooler and poured a cup, her hand perfectly steady. She placed it on the table in front of him. He stared at it as if it were poison. "I didn't come here for this, Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice even, devoid of accusation. "This is a coincidence. But now that we're here, I have to ask you one question." He finally found his voice, a raw, broken whisper. I'm sorry, I swear to God. I am so sorry for what I did. I know you are sorry for the consequences, Lila replied, her gaze unwavering. But that's not my question. My question is why? Not why you lost your temper. Why did you look at me at that moment and decide I was the one who didn't belong? The question hung in the air between them. It was the question that mattered. It went beyond the slap, beyond the argument over a bag. It went to the very heart of the matter. Pierce finally looked up, and for the first time, Lila saw something other than broken pride in his eyes. She saw a flicker of genuine, agonizing self-awareness. Because it was easy, he whispered, the admission costing him everything. Because you were different. You didn't look like the others. You were quiet, young, and I was the captain. I was in charge. In my world, things had an order. People had their place. And you didn't fit in my picture of how things should be. It was arrogant. It was wrong. It wasn't until I lost everything that I realized the picture was the problem, not you. He finally broke, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. He was not crying for his lost career or his house or his wife. He was crying for the man he had been, for the ugly truth of the prejudice he had carried so unknowingly for so long. Lila watched him for a long moment. She felt a stir of something she didn't expect, a profound, weary pity. He was not a monster. He was just a man. A flawed, broken man who had been undone by his own ignorance. She had not come for an apology, and she did not offer forgiveness. That was not her place. His atonement was between him and whatever God he believed in. Her role in his life was over. "Thank you for your honesty," she said softly. She turned and left the room, leaving him alone with his ghosts and the cup of water, still untouched. Months later, Lila was on a flight from San Francisco to Sydney. It was a Horizon Airlines A350. She sat in first class, not as an inspector, but as a passenger. As she settled in, she noticed the co-pilot making a final check of the cabin. She was a young, sharp, confident woman of color who smiled warmly at the passengers. Later during the flight, Lila watched a flight attendant spend nearly 10 minutes patiently explaining the entertainment system in broken English to an elderly couple, kneeling beside their seats to be at their eye level. A sense of deep, quiet satisfaction settled over Lila. It wasn't the thrill of victory or the gratification of revenge. It was the peaceful, profound contentment of a builder who sees her creation standing strong and true. The echoes of that ugly day were finally fading, replaced by a new, better harmony. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, simply enjoyed the flight. The cycle was broken. The unseen passenger had done her work. And so the king was dethroned, and the enabler was humbled. Daniel Pierce's story is a chilling reminder that true authority isn't found in a uniform or a title, but in character and respect, and that prejudice carries a price that can bankrupt a life's work. Lila Chen could have destroyed the airline. Instead, she rebuilt it, turning a moment of personal humiliation into a powerful force for positive change. She proved that karma isn't just about punishment, it's about renewal. What would you have done in her situation? How would you have reacted? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This story shows that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most powerful. If you believe in the power of karma and enjoy stories where arrogance meets its match, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life drama where justice is served. Thank you for watching.